come to the right spot. It's another edition of Lewis at Large. 60 minutes of smart talk radio is in your future, with guests from all walks of life and all points of view. And now, with this week's edition of Lewis at Large, here's your host, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another segment of Lewis at Large. Here's truly Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course, Smart Talk Radio, therefore, is in your future. This segment, no exception. Got a good one today. Going to talk to a guy that he's a prolific writer, observer of all things American culture. He was a former Playboy magazine editor, Hollywood screenwriter. He also writes for the Huffington Post, and specifically, from time to time, will target baby boomer issues and comedy in general. His name is John Blumenthal, and specifically, we're talking about a brand new work that John has out called 3.5 Virgins. John, how are you, my friend?
I'm fine, Warner. How are you?
Well, I'm good. I know that these interviews are part of the circuit that you're on, and you're probably cynical enough, like I am, that you could probably make fun of anything, but we don't want to make fun of this, right? We're going to be very, very proactive and very, very positive.
Oh, absolutely. I have no sense of humor, so that'll be fine.
Okay. That's good to know. John, let's share with our Lewis at Large listeners here, if you would, in Northeast Kansas. Give us a little bit more of a setup about you. Again, you spent some time at Playboy. You've done some screenwriting, but what was the path, let's just say loosely, from college that got you into the business?
Well, I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, not always, but, for a long time I wanted to be a writer, and, it's a hard field to get into. Graduated from college in 1972. I went to work as a house painter on Nantucket Island for a while. Wrote a funny letter to the editor of Esquire magazine, and oddly enough, they flew me in for an interview and gave me a job on their editorial staff, and then, which was great because, there were people, it was the height of Esquire during that time. It was like Tom Wolfe and Nora Ephron and Norman Mailer and people like that. The new journalism was taking off, but the editor left, and I got a job at Playboy magazine as an editor. They flew me to Chicago, and that was fun, needless to say. They then transferred me out to California, and then I just started writing screenplays after I left Playboy, and books.
Was it always a desire of you to write fiction, or so to speak, write what you wanted to write about versus writing for a magazine, maybe with deadlines and a little bit tighter format?
Yeah, I always wanted to write novels and screenplays because, the problem with nonfiction is you have to do research, and with fiction you can just make it up.
Yep.
I'm lazy that way.
Yeah, I'm with you. That's fine. I'm curious as to, I'd like to go back to a comment you made, the Esquire in its heyday, which I, by the way, subscribe to completely, that there was an era in which that was, I felt, without sounding too pretentious here, it was an important magazine. And maybe it's not fair. Do you look at Esquire now and still consider it that it still has an important place in what we read?
No, I don't look at it much anymore, but it seems to have fallen into that niche where a lot of magazines, have fallen into, where they have the quick article and it's like the new journalism came and went, or it's still here, I don't know, but it was exciting back then, and it's not really as exciting now, if it even exists. With people like Tom Wolfe writing and some of the others, he was probably the biggest. Nora Ephron, people like that. Those, you don't see that much anymore.
Did you have a desire ever to work for the New Yorker?
Yeah, I love the New Yorker, except the articles are so long I can't get through them. It's always more than I want to know about anything. But yeah, I guess that's the only kind of magazine that's actually survived and is in its same form, pretty much as it was when it started out in the 20s or 30s. It hasn't changed much.
Yeah. I'm curious as to, and again, we're dating ourselves here just a little bit, but do you find, are there outlets on the internet that display good writing as independent websites or independent publications there?
Yeah, there's some, but there's not the same kind of vetting anymore that there used to be.
Yeah.
When you were a writer. mean, anybody can call themselves a journalist now.
Right.
And, you know, I see typos and grammatical errors and, you know, sentences without predicates all the time. So, you know, I mean, it's the same thing with Amazon and self-publishing. It's like everybody suddenly is a novelist.
Right. Just like everybody's a rock band now because they can put out a CD at their own basement.
Yeah, that too, exactly. It's like, you know, any kind of art, you know, the popular art that, you know, creative, you know, people wanted to get into is open to them now. Anybody can do it.
Well,
talent or no talent. That's mostly no talent.
Yeah. Well, before we completely collapse into just angry old men here, let's talk about 3.5 Virgins. It is I believe it is your third novel, and give us a little bit of a setup for it.
Well, the main character is a guy, and on his 40th birthday, his wife tells him that she wants a divorce because she's going to live with a guy who lives up the street, which is, you know, not great for our hero because now he has to look out his window and watch his ex-wife, you know, water this guy's lawn and get his mail and stuff. But he's suddenly thrust into bachelorhood, and, you know, he does the internet dating thing, which, you know, turns out to be a comical mess. And eventually he starts looking back on some of the girlfriends he had in high school and college, 3 in particular. And, you know, he starts to think, well, wouldn't it be nice to maybe try to hook up with one of them again? Sure. And then he suddenly realizes that he treated them all badly. I mean, he kind of broke their hearts. He seduced them and lied and did the kind of things that people do when they're in their 20s, when they're dominated by their hormones, I guess. And he decides to apologize, go find them and apologize. And each chapter is dedicated to one of the 3 women. And the first part is, you know, the backstory on how they met and how they fell in love and how he seduced them and dumped them, et cetera, et cetera. And the second part of each girl is, you know, what they're like now and when he goes back to see them and apologize and what the reaction is. And there's a half virgin, which obviously I can't tell you what that means because it would be a spoiler. But it's, you know, it's a comedic adventure kind of, you know, with part love story, I guess you would say. It should appeal to men and women because there's, you know, you've got men and women as the main characters.
It's a novel, but it undoubtedly, for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, we'll just, again, say primarily baby boomers looking back on a love career, romance career, it seems like something a lot of people would want to do.
Would want to do or wouldn't want to do?
Might want to do. Or do you?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece for Huffington Post on a while ago, which is about, you know, looking up your old, you know, girl or boyfriends on Facebook and, you know, maybe reconnecting. I think a lot of people have done that. I've done it. And a lot of the comments on when the piece ran were about, you know, from people who had done it. Although there were some people that just didn't ever want to know. But, you know, a lot of them did it.
Those are the same kind of people that probably never would want to go to a high school reunion, too. I have a sister, and this is very poignant, I have a sister-in-law in her late 50s who is currently engaged in a romantic relationship after raising 3 children, 2 children rather, getting a divorce with someone that she reconnected from high school on Facebook, who lived halfway across the country. And I'm just recalling that story now, but I would think you'd hear about this a bunch.
Yeah, no, I have a female friend who did exactly the same thing. She went back and married her after having kids. She got a divorce and went back to Pensacola to marry her old high school boyfriend.
So it's almost.
So yeah, that is, I don't know if that, you know, had anything to do with Facebook. It might have been pre-Facebook, but, you know, she ended up making contact somehow.
Well, I do wonder if Facebook isn't the great second chance offering for a lot of people, depending on your age, I guess. John,
yeah, I'm sure it is.
Was this research for this, was this tough, or are you drawing on some personal experience?
For the book?
Yeah.
Well, you know, to be honest, there was a little bit of personal experience. There was one particular girl who I always felt guilty about. And I guess, you know, I never went to find her because she has a very common name and probably has a married name on top of that, so it would have been impossible. But if it was possible to do it, I might have. I don't know. It just, you know, it was guilt mainly. But you know what? People tell me when I tell them about that, they say, well, men and women do things like that a lot when they're young in college and high school, and it's not uncommon. So, feeling guilty about it is, perhaps being a little oversensitive.
If you've just joined us, yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck of Lewis at Large Radio, heard each and every week right here, and we are in the midst of some Smart Talk Radio with a bright guy, talented guy, John Blumenthal. He's written for Playboy magazine, he's written for Hollywood, written for Esquire magazine, and just all around just sort of observer of all things cultural and all things American and all things sort of baby boomer. John, go ahead, give our generation a grade, A to F. A meaning exceeded every and all expectations, or F, hopelessly underachieved as a generation as a whole, or are we somewhere in between?
Well, that's a hard one. I mean, there are lots of people who look down on our generation as, now being the Wall Street, types who have pretty much ruined the economy. It's like, I thought it was one of the best generations to be in because of the 60s and all the things that happened then and all the reforms and, obviously the Vietnam War, but that was bad. But, as a result, partly of it, you got feminism and a lot of other, liberal causes that were, evolved as a result. So, yeah, I mean, to me, that was one of the best periods of my life. But on the other hand, a lot of these people, from the 60s have kind of forgotten what it was all about. Driving around in BMWs and basically, doing, these kind of loans and investment banking has basically brought the country to its knees economically. So, I'm not saying it's just us. I mean, a lot of the investment bankers coming out of Hollywood or out of Harvard Business School are probably, doing it as well, and they're not our generation. But I think a lot of our generation, my generation is, pretty much about to retire because, you're everywhere from, 50 to 65 or something like that, if you were pretty much awake during the 60s. Yeah.
There's some 75,000 or 75 million of us, and I think the number, John, is somewhere around 10,000 a day hit 65.
Wow.
So there you go. Although we're certainly working, I think, a lot later age-wise than our parents did. I'll tell you one thing, see if you agree with this one, and I don't want to drift too far away from 3.5 Virgins, but I would think Generation X and Y are really sick of hearing about baby boomers.
Are really what? Sticking it to the baby boomers?
No, are sick of hearing about. We've pretty much dominated the headlines for 4 decades.
Yeah, that's true. I'm sure that's right. Absolutely. You see it in ads and everything that are, directed towards us more than anybody else.
You still going to rock concerts?
Me? Yeah, sure. Yeah. I went to one with Jimmy Webb just the other night at MacArthur Park.
Okay.
He was a songwriter who wrote MacArthur Park, so he was at MacArthur Park playing MacArthur Park.
That's about as pure as it gets. When you do, I'm curious as to the reaction, and again, I know it's a newer work, but for 3.5 Virgins that you've written, what kind of reaction are you getting?
Well, the reviews have been good, and it just recently, I was a finalist in the International Book Awards for it. So, yeah, it seems to be people, mostly people like it. Of course, some people don't. You always get that kind of thing. But a lot of people have told me or, mentioned in the Amazon reviews that they read it in one sitting, which I think is, 1 or 2 sittings, which is, a real compliment for a writer because it means that, the story was interesting enough for them to want to read it fast and really got into the book and the characters. So that's nice. I always like to hear that.
What about, this begs itself, this screams either made for or big screen movie. What do you think?
3.5 Virgins?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. I think it would make a really good movie, but it is a little bit episodic. So you go from one girl to the next, or one woman to the next. So it's not. Although it's plotted so that the character grows along the way, it's still kind of episodic, possibly too episodic for a movie. I'm not sure. But nowadays, you pretty much have to have a bestseller to sell to the movies, or some kind of gimmick that involves a superhero, because they're spending so much money now on movies, with the 3D and I have a friend who works in special effects, and for this, I think with the Lone Ranger movie he worked on, they had to build a railroad from scratch that went from a mile, which they eventually blew up, but it cost $1 million just to do the 2 rail cars and railroad tracks.
Well.
So it's ridiculously expensive, and eventually they're going to have to be charging, $25 for a ticket. They're close to it now with the glass, the 3D glasses. So, a book like this would be, kind of a low budget, independent feature probably.
Well, I'm going to think about it though. You know what? I'm going to guess, John, in this movie, the big money's going to go to who's going to play the 3 virgins, and or the 3 women, and who's going to play the guy. Why don't you play the guy?
Sorry, who'd play the guy?
Why don't you play it yourself?
Me?
Yeah, you can act.
Yeah, no, I'm not an actor. I'm camera shy. There would be, stage fright and camera shy. So no, that would never work. But besides, who'd come to see my movie with me starring in it, right?
Well, could be a breakthrough role for you. Let's explore that as a writer. You touched on something pretty telling. For the most part, the writers that the serious writers that are they uncomfortable in front of the camera? Are they uncomfortable going on the old book tour and getting on the radio, getting on TV for those morning show interviews?
Well, it differs. I think many writers are loners, but on the other hand, many writers have huge egos, and I think the ones with the huger egos are probably, more than thrilled to be on TV or, being interviewed and on, wherever and do the book show tour. But for me personally, no, I'm kind of a recluse, and it's really not my kind of thing. But yeah, sure. Take Norman Mailer. He used to love, being on TV and arguing with Gore Vidal. So yeah, some do, some don't. It's good publicity, if you can get it, obviously, but...
Well, he ended up with Marilyn Monroe, right?
Who?
Didn't Norman Mailer end up with...
He wrote the book, yeah. He wrote a pretty famous book about Marilyn.
Yeah. Hey, I've got another question for you. Is your natural desire when you write, do you go towards fiction or nonfiction? What are you most comfortable, or do you have a favorite?
Well, I prefer fiction. I've done some nonfiction. Nonfiction generally sells better than fiction. It has a longer shelf life because people use it for research and not fiction. If you go to a bookstore or the library, obviously there's a lot of nonfiction, especially libraries, more than there is fiction. Fiction has kind of a shelf life. It's everybody wants to read it, and then after a while, nobody wants to read it. Unless it's a classic, but how often does a classic come out, right?
Right. What about as you look towards the future? What's your next? And I know you're in the midst of being involved in this project, but what's the next thing on your docket?
I'm not sure. I'm pretty content writing for Huffington Post at the moment. I don't have any particular ideas. I might do something in nonfiction just because, but I don't have an idea just because it does have a longer shelf life, and it seems to sell, better. And I haven't done one since the '80s. So the one I did in the '80s was a history of Hollywood High, which I don't know if you know, but Hollywood High had pretty much most of the student body, or at least a good part of the student body, were young, celebrities.
Right, celebrity types.
Celebrities.
Right.
Like Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, Lana Turner, and people like that. So it was kind of interesting, but it was okay. It didn't do that well, but it was kind of fun doing it, and I don't mind research if it's it's interesting. But I don't want. It's not going to be anything scientific or complicated. We have to do something more or less popular.
Right.
Among readers. But no, I have no idea. So I'm just maybe blowing it out my nose here.
Yeah. What is the, without getting too overly philosophical here, but as you look at 3.5 Virgins, your new novel, what's the big takeaway? What's the lesson, so to speak, from it, from your point of view?
I would say that that you can't recapture your youth. That the past is not necessarily prologue. That people change, and you go back, try to go back, and everything, and you can't. It's all different now. And it's kind of, one man's experience with trying to recapture his youth and finding out that that's, it's just not really possible. You can have memories, but, they're not really based on anything that you are now. I mean, they're based on this kind of specter that you were back then that's, gets vaguer and vaguer as you get older and older.
As when you were writing this, and your character has gone back and is reconnecting, did the end result of the reconnection, did you have a plan for each one of how it would end, or while you were writing it, did the nature of the reconnection on any of these change?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not a lot of people use outlines. I don't use outlines. I kind of have an idea of what's going to happen and what's going to happen at the end, but it usually changes. My opinion about outlines is that, if you have an outline and you're going step by step through the outline, I mean, you can't help but be a little bit predictable. And if you're a little bit predictable and the outline is a little predictable, the reader's going to find it predictable. On the other hand, if you're kind of, just doing it as you go along and, making turns and twists, et cetera, just, from instinct, then I think the reader will find it, more twisty and turny and be surprised. I've got a lot of twists and turns in this and big surprise endings and all kinds of stuff like that because, I think that's what makes fiction interesting and, that kind of, I think the movies kind of trained me to do that because, basically in movies you have 3 acts. At the end of Act 1 you have a twist, and at the end of Act 2 you have a twist, and then, you end up at the end, and that can be a surprise ending or whatever, but, I kind of learned that from the movies, and I think it's valid. I think if a writer hasn't, gripped his audience by about page 20, 25, I mean, if I read a book of fiction, a novel, and they haven't gripped me, if I'm not interested in the characters and the story hasn't gotten started at about page 30 or 40, I just give up. I toss it because I don't think the writer is doing his job.
Right. Are you, this is kind of a, would you say you're a better writer today than you were earlier in your career, or is it possible that better works can come from people? And I'm talking about now more, let's go back to your work for periodicals. Were you to go back and write again for something like Esquire versus Huffington Post, how would you think you'd be judged? Earlier works better, later works better, or just different? And that's good enough, just being different.
Both. I think it's better now than it was then. I've always written comedic pieces. That's pretty much what I do, with a little bit of, serious stuff running through it and some drama, of course, if it's a novel. But the stuff I write for Huffington Post is strictly pretty much comedic. It's political satire, a lot of it, and quite a lot for baby boomers. I started out writing for Huffington Post in a section called Huff Post 50, which is for, obviously people who are over 50, which is,
right.
pretty much us. And, I've written a lot of stuff for them. Stuff like, my latest piece was Welcome to My Midlife Crisis. That was a comedy post.
Yeah.
I had another one called What Every Post 50 Gentleman Needs to Know. Another one called I Want My Daughters Back, which is kind of a nostalgic empty nest kind of thing in a humorous way. But, that's what I basically do. So I've gotten better at it, I think, although sometimes I look back at some of the earlier pieces and I say, boy, those were pretty good. Can I still do that? But, they're just different. Basically.
Well, the work is a good one. It's called 3.5 Virgins. It is published by our good friends at Farmer Street Press. John, I think people know this, but how can people get a copy of the book and, frankly, find out a little bit more about John Blumenthal?
Well, Amazon is probably the best, the best place to get it, at least inexpensively, for both Kindle and iPad and paperback. I've got a website. It's called 3.5virgins.net. You can find out about the book and read some of the reviews, but most of that stuff's on the Amazon page as well. And, if you're interested in Huffington Post pieces, you can just go to huffingtonpost.com and put my name in the little search box, and all my posts will come up, and you can choose which ones you want to read. Like I said, there are a lot of boomer posts, so that might be of interest to your audience.
Yeah, indeed. Hey, listen, thank you for your time. Thanks for the work. I've read some of your previous stuff. It's tremendous. And would love to have you on again.
Oh, I'd love to. Thanks so much.
You bet. Take care, my friend.
You too, Warner.
You bet. We will be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.